"When you stop breathing, I'll dance on your grave, Sebastian." That voice rose in the darkness, soft as breath, yet sharp as a blade. The most luxurious private hospital in Chicago lay submerged in the silence of late night. In the ICU, there was only the steady rhythm of the ventilator and the pale green glow from the monitor tracking a heartbeat. Cassandra Kincaid sat at her husband's bedside, her perfect face caught in the dim light, its sharp lines quietly defined. She held the hand of the man lying motionless, but not to comfort him. She held it to make sure he couldn't resist. Sebastian Kincaid, the most powerful kingpin in Chicago, was now nothing more than a living corpse sustained by machines. At least, that was what Cassandra believed. 10 years, she went on in a whisper, her voice carrying the bitterness collected over thousands of lonely nights. 10 years I lived like an ornament in your mansion. 10 years I smiled for the cameras, played the role of the perfect wife, while you treated me like air. She leaned closer, her lips nearly brushing Sebastian's ear. Do you know what it feels like to live in someone else's shadow? People only know Sebastian Kincaid. No one sees Cassandra. No one cares. The ventilator kept its even rhythm. The heart monitor kept blinking. Sebastian remained still, like a statue. But now it's different. Cassandra smiled. The first real smile she'd worn in years. I found a man who truly understands me. A man who looks at me as a human being, not a trophy to display. She stood, slowly smoothing her hair back into place. The plan's almost finished, Sebastian. And when you're gone, I'll be free. I'll have everything you ever owned. And you'll be nothing but a name on a headstone. What Cassandra didn't know was that Sebastian heard it all. Every word, every syllable, every poisonous breath from the wife he'd trusted for a decade. Inside that unmoving body, Sebastian's mind was fully awake. He couldn't open his eyes, couldn't move, couldn't scream. But he heard everything, and every sentence Cassandra spoke was a knife driving straight through his chest. A man who truly understands me. The words burrowed into Sebastian's mind like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. So there was someone else. For how long? Since when? He had trusted her. In an underworld thick with betrayal and blood, Sebastian had always believed that at least he still had one place to return to. One person he could trust. Cassandra was his wife, his family, but it turned out the most dangerous enemy wasn't the rival gangs out there. The most dangerous enemy had been lying beside him every night for 10 years. Sebastian's finger twitched, a movement so small it was almost impossible to notice. No one saw. Cassandra had her back turned, checking her phone. She typed a quick message, likely to the man who truly understood her, then slipped the phone into her handbag. At that moment, footsteps sounded in the hallway. A nurse was passing the room, as if a switch had been flipped. Cassandra transformed completely. Her shoulders sagged. Her eyes reddened as if she'd been crying for hours. That cold voice vanished, replaced by a trembling, pitiful grief. "Oh, Sebastian," she sobbed, pressing her husband's hand to her cheek. "Please wake up. I need you. I can't live without you." The nurse paused at the doorway, looking in with sympathy. She saw a wife shattered by her husband's coma. She saw love and pain. She didn't see the devil wearing a human face that Sebastian had just come to know. When the nurse moved on, Cassandra let go of Sebastian's hand as if it were something filthy. She took a tissue and dabbed at her eyes, though there wasn't a single real tear. "Acting is exhausting," she muttered. "But it won't be much longer now." She picked up her handbag and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned back for one last look at Sebastian. "Sleep well, my dear husband. I hope this is your last sleep." The door clicked shut. The ICU fell into silence again. And in that darkness, Sebastian Kincaid lay motionless, but his mind was roaring. He couldn't cry, couldn't scream, couldn't do a single thing, but he swore to himself, in the most painful moment of his life, that he wouldn't die. Not today. Not like this. And when he woke, the most dangerous man in Chicago would show her what real betrayal looks like. But first, he needed to know more. He needed to hear more, and his silence would become his deadliest weapon. The most powerful man in Chicago had just realized the greatest enemy of his life had shared his bed for 10 years. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share so it can reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next twists in this gripping story. 48 hours before those poisonous whispers drifted through the ICU room, Sebastian Kincaid was driving through Chicago's curtain of rain. That night, the city looked as if it had been drowned beneath a sheet of ashen water, raindrops lashing the windshield like thousands of tiny bullets. Sebastian had just left a meeting at a warehouse on the south side, where he'd sat with his associates to discuss expanding the business network. The meeting had run longer than expected, and now the clock was edging close to midnight. He was alone in a luxury SUV, refusing to let a driver pick him up as usual. Sometimes Sebastian needed moments like this, moments of solitude, when he could think without anyone disturbing him. The rain fell, the roads were empty, and his mind wandered back through the years. People called him a Mafia boss, the most dangerous man in Chicago, a ghost of the underworld, but Sebastian knew who he was. He'd grown up on the poor West Side, where his childhood was made of thin meals and gunfire cracking every night. He'd built his empire from nothing, yet he'd never forgotten where he started. Unlike other criminals, Sebastian had rules. He never dealt drugs, the thing that had killed his mother when he was 12 years old. He never harmed civilians, innocent people who had nothing to do with the games of the underworld. And he always protected the neighborhood where he'd grown up, turning it into the safest place in Chicago, even though the police never bothered to set foot there. Some said Sebastian Kincaid was ruthless. Some said he was a hero to the abandoned. The truth lived somewhere in between, and Sebastian didn't care to explain. He did what he believed was right, in his own way. The vehicle turned onto a deserted road near the industrial district. It was a shortcut Sebastian often took to avoid the city's curious eyes. On both sides stood abandoned factories, brick walls stained and peeling, windows shattered like empty eye sockets. Streetlights flickered in the rain, throwing alternating bands of light and shadow like something out of a horror film. Sebastian frowned when a lamp ahead went dark, then flared back to life, then died again. He slowed a little, the survival instinct honed by years in the underworld pulling him into alertness. But he wasn't fast enough. A truck burst from the intersection ahead like a monster out of the dark. No headlights, no horn, no brakes. Sebastian only had time to register that massive block of metal for a split second before everything exploded. Metal screamed as it struck metal. Glass shattered like frozen tears. Time splintered into 1,000 pieces. Sebastian's SUV was flung sideways, spinning twice before slamming into a light pole. The airbags blew, but not enough to stop his head from cracking into the steering wheel. Blood ran down his forehead, hot and slick. The world reeled, then sank into darkness. When the first people reached the scene, they found a luxury vehicle twisted beyond recognition. Inside, Sebastian Kincaid lay motionless, his face smeared with blood, his breathing faint. But what was strange was that the truck that had caused the crash was gone. No trace, no driver, no plate, as if it had never existed. Was it an accident, or an assassination carefully arranged? That question would haunt many people in the days to come. The news spread faster than fire in that rainy night. Sebastian Kincaid, the untouchable, has fallen. Chicago's underworld convulsed. Phones rang in dark rooms. Secret meetings were called. Sebastian's enemies smiled in the shadows, while his allies held their breath and waited. An empire was wobbling, and the vultures had already begun to circle above Chicago's sky. But no one knew that Sebastian Kincaid wasn't dead, and inside that unmoving body, a new war was about to begin. Connor Kincaid was deep in sleep when the phone rang, tearing the night wide open. 2 a.m, Marcus's number glowed on the screen, the man responsible for Sebastian's security. Connor knew at once something was wrong, because Marcus never called at this hour unless something truly serious had happened. Your brother's been in an accident. They're bringing him to Street Mary's now. It's bad. The words hit Connor like a bucket of ice dumped straight onto his chest. The blood in his body seemed to thicken, his heart stopping for a few seconds. Sebastian, his brother, the man he admired more than anyone in the world, the one who'd raised him after their parents died, the one who'd taught him everything about life in the underworld. Connor threw himself out of bed, yanking on clothes while still gripping the phone. He sprinted to the garage, leapt into the car, and hit the gas as if he were racing death itself. On the way to the hospital, he made call after call. Summon all his men, increase security at every business site, lock down information until further orders. Connor Kincaid might have only been the younger brother, the right hand. But while Sebastian couldn't act, Connor would stand up and carry everything. When Connor reached Street Mary's hospital, the scene in front of him left him reeling. Reporters from everywhere had packed the entrance, flashes popping non-stop like lightning in the dark. News of Sebastian Kincaid's crash had spread with unbelievable speed, and now all of Chicago was watching. Connor had to push through the crowd, hospital security carving a path for him inside, and then he saw Cassandra. His sister-in-law stood before a forest of cameras, dressed in a funeral black dress, her face pale beneath makeup smeared by tears. Her eyes were red, her shoulders trembling, her hands clenched together as if she were trying to keep herself from collapsing. "My husband. Please. Everyone. Pray for my husband." Cassandra's voice broke, splintering between sobs. "Sebastian is everything to me. I don't know what I'll do if I don't have him." Cameras blazed, capturing the image of a wife shattered by grief. Reporters shoved and jostled to get the best angle. This was the top story, the moment the whole city had been waiting for. Connor stood behind them, watching his sister-in-law in silence. Something was off. He couldn't name it exactly, but an unfamiliar feeling gnawed at him from the inside. Maybe it was the way Cassandra stood. A touch too straight for someone who was falling apart. Maybe it was her eyes, flicking now and then toward the camera lens with a calculation so subtle it was almost invisible. Or maybe Connor was simply too tense and imagining everything. He shoved the thought aside and stepped toward Cassandra. At that moment, the emergency room doors swung open. A doctor in surgical scrubs stained with blood came out, his expression grave. "Mr. Kincaid's family?" Cassandra turned, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm his wife. How is my husband?" The doctor took a deep breath. "We're doing everything we can, but his condition is critical. Severe head trauma. The family should prepare themselves." Cassandra crumpled. Her legs seemed to lose all strength, her body folding down like a puppet with its strings cut. Connor moved on instinct, catching his sister-in-law before she hit the floor, holding her in his arms. "No, it can't be." Cassandra sobbed, burying her face against Connor's chest. "Sebastian, he can't die. He promised he'd stay with me forever." Connor held her, trying to comfort her while his own heart was breaking apart. But even inside that pain, he noticed something strange. Cassandra's tears didn't soak into his shirt. She was crying, sobbing, trembling in his arms. But the fabric against his chest stayed dry, not a single tear truly fell. Connor blinked, wondering if he'd mistaken it. Maybe he was too overwhelmed. Maybe grief was twisting his mind. Cassandra loved Sebastian. Everyone knew that. She'd been the perfect wife for 10 years, always at Sebastian's side through everything. Something wasn't right. But pain blurred reason, and Connor pushed the thought away. This wasn't the time for suspicion. This was the time to be strong. For Sebastian, for the family, for everything they'd built. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and one day, it would sprout. Dr. Raymond Cole was one of the finest neurosurgeons in Chicago, and tonight he was facing the hardest case of his career. Sebastian Kincaid was rushed into the operating room in critical condition, his body mangled after the horrific collision. Severe traumatic brain injury with a subdural hematoma. Internal bleeding in the abdomen. 3 broken ribs, one of them nearly puncturing a lung. Dr. Cole looked at the bruised, broken body on the table and wondered whether any miracle could save this man. But he fought anyway. For 6 hours, the medical team worked without pause. Sweat ran down Dr. Cole's forehead as he carefully removed the clot pressing against Sebastian's brain. Nurses watched the vital signs relentlessly, calling out even the smallest changes. Blood was transfused, medications were pushed, and the entire operating room seemed to hold its breath with every faint beat of the patient's heart. Then the worst happened. The heart monitor suddenly released a long, terrifying tone. The jagged line flattened into a single, unbroken bar. Sebastian's heart had stopped. No pulse. "Get the defibrillator ready." "Doctor," Cole shouted, his voice echoing through an operating room that had turned instantly chaotic. One nurse began chest compressions while another prepared the defibrillator. 19 seconds. 19 seconds was how long Sebastian's heart stopped. 19 seconds in which the team fought death itself, clawing back every sliver of hope. Shock. Clear. The defibrillator sounded. Sebastian's body jerked on the table. The line on the screen stayed flat. Increase the power. Shock again. The second time. His body jolted again. And then, like a miracle, the line began to rise and fall once more. Weak, but steady. Sebastian's heart was beating again. The whole operating room exhaled as if they'd been brought back from the edge with him. Dr. Cole wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking from the life-and-death moment that had just passed. They continued the operation, finishing the final steps before closing the incision. Sebastian Kincaid had survived, but the question was whether he would ever wake up. Outside the operating room, Connor and Cassandra had waited through 6 hours of hell. When Dr. Cole stepped out in scrubs still stained with blood, both of them rose at once. "The surgery is finished," Dr. Cole said, his voice exhausted but professional. "Mr. Kincaid is out of immediate danger, but his brain has been badly injured and it's swelling. He is in a deep coma now." "When will he wake up?" Cassandra asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Cole was silent for a moment before he answered. "We don't know. It could be a few days, a few weeks, a few months, or it could be never. The brain is the most complex organ in the body, and we can't predict what will happen." Cassandra broke into sobs, her shoulders shaking violently. She covered her face with her hands, her choked crying echoing down the empty corridor. "No, Sebastian. You can't leave me." A perfect performance. If anyone looked closely, they might have noticed Cassandra's eyes were dry behind the fingers covering her face. Connor stood as still as stone, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He only stared into nothing with hollow eyes. Sebastian, the brother who'd raised him, was lying on the thin line between life and death, and Connor could do nothing but wait. But no one knew that inside the unmoving body in the ICU bed, Sebastian Kincaid was waking up. He opened his eyes in darkness. Not the darkness of the room, but the darkness of his own mind. He could hear the ventilator's steady rhythm, the beep of the heart monitor, the footsteps of nurses moving outside. He heard everything. But when he tried to open his eyes, his lids didn't respond. When he tried to move a finger, his body didn't obey. When he tried to scream, his throat went silent, as if it had been crushed shut. Panic flooded Sebastian's mind like a tidal wave. He was trapped, imprisoned inside his own body, his mind fully awake, yet unable to do anything, unable to speak, unable to let anyone know he was still alive inside this motionless shell. The first hours were hell. Sebastian strained with everything he had to move, to make any sound at all, to tell the outside world he was still here. But his body betrayed him completely. He could only lie there, listening, waiting. Then, slowly, the survival instinct sharpened by years in the underworld began to kick in. Sebastian stopped panicking. He began to think. In the underworld, information was worth more than bullets. Whoever knew more, won. And now Sebastian was in a position no one would ever suspect. He could hear everything without anyone knowing he was listening. He could watch without anyone knowing he was watching. Everyone thought he was unconscious. They would say things they'd never say if he were awake. They would reveal their true faces. Sebastian made a decision. He would not wake up. Not yet. He would lie here, listen, gather information, and wait for the right moment. His silence would become his deadliest weapon. On the third night shift after the accident, St. Mary's Hospital settled into the familiar stillness of the late hours. The corridors were empty, holding only the soft footsteps of night nurses and the steady, mechanical breathing of machines behind closed doors. That was when Isla Mercer stepped into Sebastian Kincaid's ICU room for the first time. She'd just been assigned to this special patient, replacing the previous nurse who'd asked for leave under the weight of pressure that came with the name of the man in that bed. Isla was 27, slender, with brown hair neatly tied back at the nape of her neck. Her blue eyes carried a deep sadness, a kind of sorrow that had become such a part of her that people no longer noticed it. She moved lightly, but with certainty, every gesture marked by the quiet professionalism of someone accustomed to standing close to death. She set her chart on the table and began checking the machines around the bed. The heart monitor, the ventilator, the IV bag, the catheter. Isla inspected everything with meticulous care, recording each detail in the file. She was a good nurse, maybe one of the best here, but she never bragged about it. She simply did her job, silently, faithfully. When she finished the checks, Isla stood at the bedside and looked down at the motionless man, Sebastian Kincaid. She'd heard plenty about that name. Who in Chicago hadn't heard of the city's most powerful mafia boss? People said he was dangerous, ruthless, a ghost of the underworld. But Isla had seen too many people in hospital beds to believe death cared who was powerful and who was weak. Before death, everyone was equal. Looking at Sebastian's face, bruised and swollen, white bandages wrapped around his head, Isla didn't see a mafia kingpin. She saw a human being fighting to live, and it stirred memories she'd tried to bury for 2 years. 2 years earlier, on a night like this, Isla had been working a night shift when her phone rang. A call from the fire department. The small suburban house outside Chicago where her family lived had gone up in flames at 3 a.m. When Isla arrived, there was nothing left but ash and 3 burned bodies that couldn't be identified. Her father, her mother, and Tommy, her younger brother who was only 19. They hadn't made it out. The cause of the fire was never officially announced, but Isla knew the truth. Her father had borrowed from loan sharks to pay for her mother's treatment, and when he couldn't repay, they'd burned the house as a warning to other debtors. Isla had survived only because she'd been on a night shift. She'd survived because she hadn't been home. Now Isla was alone in the world. She carried the debt her father had left behind, living in a tiny studio apartment that had room for nothing more than a bed and a small table. She worked every day, not because she loved it, but because she didn't know what else to do. Her life was a chain of endless shifts, sleepless nights, and a loneliness no words could fully hold. Isla blinked, pulling herself out of that painful current of memory. She looked at Sebastian again, and somehow, she felt an urge to talk to him. Maybe because the night was too quiet. Maybe because she'd grown too used to talking to herself. Or maybe because she believed coma patients could still hear, even if they couldn't respond. Isla pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. She studied Sebastian's still face and began to speak, her voice gentle, as if she were sharing a secret. "I don't know who you are, Mr. Kincaid. I mean, I know what people say about you. They say you're dangerous. They say you're the kind of man nobody wants as an enemy." She paused, watching the heartbeat trace rising and falling steadily on the monitor. "But I've seen enough death to know when someone is fighting, and you're fighting. I can see that." Isla leaned in, her voice turning more honest, more personal. "So don't give up. Whoever you are, whatever you've done, you deserve a chance to fight. Everyone deserves that." Inside the unmoving body, Sebastian heard every word, and for the first time since he'd awakened inside the darkness of himself, he felt something warm. Not the chill in Cassandra's voice when she whispered about dancing on his grave, not the counterfeit worry in his wife's practice performance, but sincerity, real concern from a complete stranger. This girl didn't know who he was. She wasn't afraid of him, didn't need anything from him, had no reason to be kind to him. And yet she was here, in the quiet of the late night, giving him the encouragement his own wife had never once offered. Sebastian couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything to let her know he was listening, but in his mind, he held on to that voice. Isla Mercer's voice, the voice of a stranger who wanted him to live, while the wife of 10 years was waiting for him to die. On the 5th day after the accident, St. Mary's Hospital received a special visitor. Dr. Derek Shaw, one of Chicago's leading neurological specialists, was invited in to consult on Sebastian Kincaid's case. Derek was 40, tall, with neatly combed salt and pepper hair and sharp, icy gray eyes. He moved with the confidence of a man used to admiration, every gesture carrying an arrogance hidden beneath a layer of professional courtesy. His reputation in the medical world was undeniable. He'd saved hundreds of patients through the most complex brain surgeries, and the name Derek Shaw had become synonymous with excellence in neurology. But no one knew that behind that perfect exterior was a completely different man. Derek entered Sebastian's ICU room alone, closing the door behind him. He stood beside the bed and looked down at the motionless man with eyes that held not a trace of compassion. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted into a contemptuous smile. "You're more stubborn than she said," Derek murmured, his voice cold as ice. "But it's fine. It doesn't matter." Sebastian heard everything. That sentence rang through his mind like an alarm bell. She said, "Who was Derek talking about?" Someone had spoken to Derek about him, and that person clearly didn't want him to survive. A chill spread through Sebastian's chest as he began fitting the pieces together. The sound of the door opening cut through Sebastian's thoughts. A familiar step, the soft tap of high heels against tile. "Cassandra, I'm here," she said, but not in the trembling, grief-stricken voice she used in front of others. This was her natural voice, easy, relaxed, almost eager. "Nobody saw you come in, did they?" Derek asked. "No. I was careful." Sebastian felt as if a knife had just been driven straight through his chest. Cassandra and Derek, they knew each other, not just as doctor and a patient's family member. The way they spoke, the intimacy in their tone, it all pointed to something far deeper. "How is it?" Cassandra asked, impatience edging her words. "How much longer?" Derek exhaled. "His brain damage is pretty severe. He might never wake up on his own." "Might?" Cassandra stressed every syllable. "I don't want to hear might, Derek. I want certainty." A heavy silence settled over the room. Sebastian held his breath, waiting for what came next. "What if he wakes up?" Cassandra went on, her voice turning frighteningly cold. "What if he recovers completely? Derek hesitated before answering, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. There are ways to make sure that doesn't happen. Sebastian's heart seemed to stop. Had he misheard? No, he heard every word clearly. Derek Shaw, a doctor, was suggesting killing him. And Cassandra, his wife, the woman he'd shared a life with for 10 years, was listening without the slightest objection. Do it, Cassandra said, her tone final, as if she were placing an order. I've waited 10 years. I don't want to wait anymore. Are you sure? Derek asked. Once we start, there's no going back. I've never been more sure. Cassandra's voice was steel. Sebastian stole 10 years of my youth. He turned me into a decoration in his luxurious mansion. I deserve more than that. I deserve to have everything. Derek gave a soft laugh. And you will have everything. His money, his power, all of it will be yours as the grieving widow. The grieving widow, Cassandra repeated, her voice edged with mockery. I like the sound of that. Inside his unmoving body, Sebastian felt his world collapsing around him. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a death sentence signed by the very woman he'd trusted most in his life. Cassandra wasn't only cheating. She was plotting to kill him. And Derek Shaw, the man invited to save him, had been invited to make sure he never woke up. 10 years. Sebastian had given 10 years of his life to this woman. He'd protected her, given her everything she wanted, trusted her completely. And this was how she repaid him. With a knife in his back, with a cold, calculated plan to take his life. I miss you, Cassandra suddenly said, her voice turning softer. But not for Sebastian. Footsteps shifted. And then the sound of a kiss. Sebastian knew they were kissing, right beside his bed, right in front of him, the man they believed was in a coma. Soon, Derek whispered. Soon, we won't have to hide anymore. I can't wait, Cassandra answered, desire thick in her voice. Their footsteps faded, and then the door closed. The room sank into silence. Sebastian lay there, motionless. But inside him, a violent storm raged. Rage, pain, and resolve. They wanted him dead, so he would live. He would live to see the day they paid for everything. Connor Kincaid sat in Sebastian's office in the high-rise building overlooking downtown Chicago. But he wasn't looking out the window. His eyes were fixed on the photographs spread across the desk, images of him and Sebastian through the years, from when Connor was a 12-year-old boy who'd lost his parents to the day he became the right hand of the most powerful kingpin in Chicago. Sebastian wasn't just his brother. He was his father, his teacher, the only person Connor had ever trusted without reservation in this world. And now that man was lying in a hospital bed, deep in a coma, with no one knowing whether he would live or die. The phone rang, shattering the silence. Connor glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number, but he answered anyway. In the underworld, sometimes the most important calls came from numbers nobody would expect. Connor Kincaid, he said, his voice cold, guarded. Connor, it's been a long time. The voice on the other end made Connor go rigid. He knew it instantly. Frank Moreno, Sebastian's longtime enemy, the boss who controlled Chicago's east side, the man who'd tried again and again to encroach on Kincaid territory and failed every time. Frank was an old fox of the underworld, cunning, ruthless, and never one to miss a chance to stab an opponent in the back. Frank, Connor answered, forcing his tone to stay even. What do you want? I heard about your brother. What a tragedy. Frank's voice carried a sympathy so fake it made Connor's stomach turn. Chicago sends its condolences to the Kincaid family. Connor ground his teeth. He knew this wasn't a condolence call. Frank Moreno never did anything without a purpose. Every word was a blade hidden under sweet silk. My brother isn't dead, Connor said, his voice hard. If you're calling to offer condolences, you're a little early. Frank chuckled, a low, dull sound through the phone like stones grinding together. Not dead. That's right. But you know, Connor, in our world, not yet is a very fragile phrase. Today, not yet. Tomorrow, it could be different. Are you threatening me? Connor asked flatly. Threatening you? No. I'm only stating the truth. Frank went on, his voice turning more serious. Business doesn't stop just because one man goes down. Connor. Sebastian's in the hospital. Nobody knows when he'll wake up, or if he'll wake up at all. Meanwhile, his partners are nervous. His roots are sitting open, and there are plenty of people ready to fill those empty spaces. Connor tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles went white. My brother will wake up. And when he does, you'd better pray you haven't done anything you'll regret. I don't pray, Connor. I act, Frank replied. Maybe it's time we sat down and discussed some new terms. New arrangements for a new reality. You're a smart man. You know what I mean. I know you're trying to fish in muddy water, Connor said, contempt thick in his voice. But you're forgetting one thing. My brother isn't dead, and as long as he's breathing, I won't let anyone touch what belongs to the Kincaid family. Frank went silent for a moment, then laughed again. As long as he's breathing. Nice line. His voice dropped, cold and threatening. But you should remember, Connor, in this world, breath can be cut off at any time. See you soon. The call ended. Connor sat there, staring at the dark phone screen, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Frank Moreno had called right after Sebastian's accident. Not a day later, not a week later, but only a few days after, as if he'd known in advance, as if he'd been waiting. A dark thought began to take shape in Connor's mind. Was Sebastian's crash really an accident? A truck with no lights, no brakes, bursting from the dark and then disappearing without a trace. The driver vanished like smoke. No one had found a single lead, and now Frank Moreno was here, ready to swallow Sebastian's territory like a vulture waiting for its prey to stop breathing. Connor didn't believe in coincidence. In the underworld, there was no coincidence. Only plots and action. He picked up the phone and dialed another number. After a few rings, a warm, steady voice answered, Harold Bennett speaking. Harold, it's Connor. I need your help with something. Harold Bennett was the Kincaid family's personal attorney, a 55-year-old man with silver hair and sharp eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses. He was one of the few people outside the family Sebastian trusted completely. What do you need, Connor? Harold asked. I need you to check everything. My brother's assets, his will, the inheritance. Everything connected to who gets what if he... Connor didn't finish the sentence, but Harold understood. You think someone's targeting Sebastian? I don't know, Connor admitted. But I need to know who stands to gain the most if my brother dies, and I need to know now. I'll start immediately, Harold said, his tone grave. Connor, do you think the accident wasn't an accident? Connor looked out the window, where Chicago sprawled beneath the night lights like a carpet of diamonds. Somewhere out there, someone was plotting against his family, and he would find them, even if he had to turn the whole city upside down. I don't know, Harold, but I'll find out. On the 7th night after the accident, St. Mary's Hospital sank into the familiar hush of the late hours. Isla Mercer sat at the nurse's station, fluorescent light washing down over the stack of medical charts in front of her. It was her habit on every night shift to recheck every patient's medication record to make sure nothing had been missed. Sebastian Kincaid had become her special patient, not because of who he was, but because she'd spent so many nights sitting by his bed, talking to him as if he could hear her. Isla turned to Sebastian's medication notes and began comparing them with the original treatment plan. Her eyes moved line by line, checking dosages, timing, the signatures of the prescribing physicians. Everything looked normal until she stopped at one number. Midazolam, the sedative used to keep a coma patient stable. The original dose was 2 milligrams every 6 hours, but over the past 2 days, the dose had been increased 3 times, reaching 6 milligrams every 6 hours. Isla frowned and flipped back through earlier pages to confirm. She wasn't mistaken. The dosage had tripled in a very short time, and the signature authorizing it was Dr. Derek Shaw. She knew Derek Shaw. Who in this hospital didn't know that famous neurological specialist? He'd been invited to consult on Sebastian, and everyone trusted his judgment without question. But something wasn't right. Isla had been a nurse for 5 years. She knew exactly what each medication did. Midazolam at a dose that high wouldn't just keep a patient sedated. It would suppress the central nervous system, slowing the brain's recovery. In other words, instead of helping Sebastian wake up, this drug was keeping him buried deep in coma. This isn't treatment, Isla whispered to herself, her voice trembling. This is... She couldn't make herself finish the thought. It was too terrifying, too insane. A celebrated doctor like Derek Shaw couldn't do something like that. There had to be a medical reason she didn't understand. There had to be. But Isla couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. She took out her phone and searched for information on safe midazolam dosing for traumatic brain injury. The results confirmed what she feared. The dose Derek Shaw was ordering was far beyond the safe range. There was no medical justification for increasing it that fast, especially for a patient whose brain needed every chance to recover. Derek Shaw was poisoning Sebastian Kincaid. Slowly, quietly, under the cover of medical treatment, Isla lowered her phone, her hands shaking. She was just a nurse, with no money, no power, no one to rely on. Sebastian Kincaid was the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, surrounded by a world she didn't belong to. Cassandra Kincaid was his legal wife, the beautiful, powerful woman Isla had seen on TV crying and begging her husband to wake up. Derek Shaw was a renowned doctor with a spotless reputation. If Isla spoke up, who would believe her? An ordinary nurse accusing a top specialist of killing a patient. They'd laugh in her face. They'd say she was jealous, delusional, or trying to get attention. And worse, if Derek Shaw really was doing this, if he found out she'd discovered it, what would happen to her? Isla wasn't naive. She knew people willing to kill usually didn't hesitate to kill one more to keep a mouth shut. She could stay silent. She could pretend she'd seen nothing, knew nothing. She could keep doing her job and leave Sebastian Kincaid's fate to be decided by other people. But then Tommy's face rose in her mind. Her brother, 19, with a bright smile and a dream of becoming a doctor. Tommy had died in a fire that nobody saved him from. Tommy had died because people with power decided his life wasn't worth much. Tommy had died because no one stood up to protect her family. If Isla stayed silent tonight, she would become part of the darkness that had killed her brother. She would become someone who watched while an innocent person was harmed. She would betray herself and everything she believed in. "I've already lost everyone," Isla whispered, her blue eyes turning toward the ICU room where Sebastian lay. "I'm not letting it happen to someone else." She stood, took a bag of normal saline from the medication cabinet. Her hands shook as she walked toward Sebastian's room, her eyes constantly scanning to make sure no one was watching. The corridor was empty, only the echo of her own footsteps in the late night. Isla entered the ICU room and closed the door behind her. She looked at the sedative drip feeding into Sebastian, then down at the bag of normal saline in her hand. This was a point of no return. If she did this and got caught, she'd lose her job, lose everything. But if she didn't, Sebastian Kincaid would die. Isla drew a deep breath and began replacing the bag. Her hand still trembled, but her movements were fast and precise, sharpened by years of experience. She removed the midazolam, hung the saline, adjusted the drip rate to match exactly what it had been before. No one glancing at it would see the difference. Sebastian wouldn't receive the poison anymore, and his brain would have a chance to recover. When she finished, Isla stood by the bed and looked down at the motionless man. "I don't know if you deserve to be saved," she whispered, "but you deserve a chance to fight. Everyone does." Inside his unmoving body, Sebastian heard it all, and for the first time, he understood that this stranger was risking her life to protect him. On the 8th night, Isla returned to Sebastian's ICU room with a bag of normal saline hidden in her pocket. She'd done it the night before, and nothing had happened. No one had noticed. The medication had been swapped. Sebastian had remained there, and the world had kept turning as if nothing had changed. But tonight, she had a sense of unease she couldn't explain. Maybe it was because the hallway felt too empty. Maybe it was the way the lights flickered strangely at the far end of the corridor. Or maybe it was simply her nerves stretched tight as wire after days of living inside a secret. Isla slipped into the room and closed the door softly behind her. She looked at Sebastian, lying motionless on the bed, the ventilator's steady rhythm, like the pulse of time itself. "I'm back again," she whispered, even though she believed he couldn't hear, or at least that's what she thought. She moved to the bedside, pulled out the saline bag, and began the replacement routine. Her hands were steadier than last night, no longer trembling the way they had the first time. She unhooked the sedative bag, ready to hang the saline instead. Then she heard footsteps, leather shoes tapping against tile, even, confident, coming closer and closer. Someone was walking toward this room. Isla's heart climbed into her throat. She rushed, hands shaking, trying to finish before whoever it was arrived. But the urgency unbalanced her. The saline bag slipped from her fingers, nearly falling to the floor. Isla caught it in time, but the clumsy motion made her drop the sedative bag onto Sebastian's bed. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Isla shoved the sedative bag into her pocket, snapped the saline into the IV line as fast as she could, and adjusted the drip rate with desperate speed. She had just finished when the door opened. Derek Shaw stepped inside. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame throwing a dark silhouette against the hallway light. His icy gray eyes swept the room, then locked on Isla. "Working late, Nurse Mercer?" Derek's voice was gentle, but there was a hidden edge beneath it that made Isla's spine go cold. She forced her face into calm, refusing to show even a flicker of panic. "Just checking the vital signs, doctor," Isla answered, so steady she surprised herself. "It's my routine on night shift." Derek nodded slowly and walked in. Each of his steps felt like a drumbeat counting down inside Isla's head. He stopped at the bedside, looked down at Sebastian, then lifted his gaze to the IV bag. Isla felt her heart stop. He was staring at it. He was staring at what she'd just replaced. Would he notice? Had she missed something? Some tiny difference? Had she made one fatal mistake? The moment stretched on. Endless. Derek stood there in silence, gray eyes fixed on the drip. Isla stood on the other side of the bed, fighting not to breathe too fast, not to sweat, not to do anything that might feed his suspicion. She could feel the sedative bag in her pocket, heavy as an accusation. If Derek asked to check, if he found it, everything would be over. Not just her career, maybe her life. At last, Derek turned to Isla. He didn't speak. He only looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. She felt exposed, as if he could see straight through her and into every secret she was trying to hide. "The vital signs are stable," Isla said, trying to break the terrifying silence. "Nothing abnormal." Derek nodded slowly. "Good. Let me know if anything changes." He turned and walked toward the door. Isla felt as if a stone had been lifted off her chest. She wanted to exhale, to sit down, because her legs were shaking so hard they threatened to fold. But she didn't. She stood there, wearing her professional mask, waiting for Derek to leave. Derek stepped through the doorway, but then he stopped. He turned his head back, looking at Isla over his shoulder. His eyes were different now, no longer cold and blank, but filled with suspicion and calculation. She could almost see the gears turning, fitting pieces together, searching for what didn't belong. "Nurse Mercer," Derek said, his voice slow. "You seem very devoted to this patient." Isla swallowed hard. "I'm devoted to all my patients, doctor." Derek watched her a moment longer, then nodded. "Of course. Have a good night." He left, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Isla stood frozen until the sound was completely gone. Then she let out a breath, trembling with fear. Her knees nearly buckled, and she had to grip the bedrail to keep from falling. She knew Derek was suspicious. That last look had said everything. He wasn't certain yet, but he was watching. And once Derek Shaw started watching someone, that person wasn't safe anymore. Isla was walking a wire. One small mistake, one careless second, and she'd plunge into the abyss. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not while Sebastian Kincaid still lay there, depending on the saline bags she swapped each night. Inside the unmoving body, Sebastian had heard everything. The conversation, the tension in Isla's voice, Derek's suspicious stare. And for the first time, he understood an astonishing truth. This girl, this stranger of a nurse he'd never known, was risking her life to protect him. Not for money, not for power, not for anything he could ever give her. She was doing it simply because she believed it was right. In Sebastian's world, where loyalty was bought with money and betrayal was ordinary, that kind of selfless kindness was a luxury he'd forgotten existed. And now, trapped in his own darkness, he felt it again from someone who was completely unknown to him. On the 9th night, Street Mary's hospital sank into the deep stillness of the very latest hours. The hallway was empty, holding only the pallid glow of fluorescent lights and the steady pulse of machines drifting out from patient rooms. Isla Mercer sat in the chair beside Sebastian's bed, her body worn down to the bone after days of unbroken strain. She'd already changed the drip, checked the numbers, finished everything that needed doing, but she didn't want to leave. Something held her there, an invisible thread tying her to the man lying motionless in the bed. Tonight, Isla felt lonelier than she ever had. The encounter with Derek Shaw still haunted her, his suspicious eyes burning into her back every time she walked the hospital corridors. She knew she was playing with fire, risking her life for a man she didn't even know, but she couldn't stop. She'd come too far to turn around now. "You know," Isla began, her voice light as breath in the quiet. It was her habit, talking to coma patients. Studies said they might be able to hear, and whether they could or not, speaking made her feel a little less alone. "I had a little brother. His name was Tommy." She paused, swallowing hard. This was the first time she'd spoken about Tommy to anyone since the fire. Not to coworkers, not to friends, not to anyone, but tonight, in this still room, beside a man she was risking everything to save. Isla felt she could finally open her heart. Tommy wanted to be a doctor, she went on, her voice trembling slightly. He was always talking about saving people, about helping the sick. He was so smart. He got into medical school on a full scholarship. Our whole family was so proud of him. A tear slipped down Isla's cheek. She didn't bother to wipe it away. Isn't it ironic? My brother wanted to be a doctor so he could save people. And I'm a nurse. I was trained to care for patients, to keep people alive. But I couldn't save my own family. The ventilator's steady rhythm sounded like the heartbeat of time itself, indifferent to her pain. That night, I was here at the hospital on a night shift. By the time I got the call, everything was already over. My parents, Tommy, all of them couldn't get out. The house burned to the ground. Isla lowered her head, and now her tears were coming in a stream. Sometimes I wonder why I survived. What does it mean to be the only one left? I wake up every day in an empty apartment, go to work, come home, and there's no one to talk to, no one to share with, no one to remember my family with me. She lifted her hand to wipe her tears, and without thinking, she took Sebastian's hand. His hand was warm, still carrying life, even though his body lay unmoving as stone. I don't know why I'm telling you this, Isla whispered. Maybe because you can't judge me. Maybe because you're the only one I can talk to without having to pretend I'm strong. She gave Sebastian's hand a gentle squeeze, searching for a little comfort in his warmth, and then she felt it. A faint pressure. Sebastian's fingers tightened around hers. Isla froze. She told herself she'd imagined it. Her body had been tense too long. She'd gone too many nights without sleep. Her mind had to be playing tricks on her, but she waited anyway, holding her breath, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it inside her ears. A few seconds passed. Nothing happened. Isla exhaled, letting out a small, sad laugh at herself. What was she expecting? Sebastian was in a deep coma, his brain severely injured. A hand squeeze was only the illusion of a tired, lonely girl. Then a thought flashed through her mind. What if it wasn't an illusion? Can you hear me? Isla whispered, her voice shaking. She squeezed Sebastian's hand softly, like a signal. 1 second, 2, 3. Then Sebastian's fingers tightened again. This time, clearer, more deliberate. Impossible to mistake. Isla's mouth fell open, her blue eyes widening in shock. Her heart felt like it was trying to break free of her chest. She stared down at their joined hands, at Sebastian's fingers, then up at his motionless face. He was awake. Sebastian Kincaid was fully conscious. He was listening. He was here, trapped inside this unmoving body, hearing everything. Everything. The thought cut through Isla's mind like lightning. If he was awake, if he could hear, then he'd heard it all. Cassandra's poisonous whispers. Derek's conversation with his wife about how to kill him. Everything Isla had done to protect him. Dear God, Isla whispered, her voice catching. You know everything. She waited. Sebastian squeezed once. Confirmation. Tears slid down Isla's cheeks again. But this time they weren't only grief. She didn't know what she was feeling. Relief that he was still here. Terror at what he'd heard. Or a trembling realization that she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. I'll help you, she whispered, tightening her grip on his hand. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. You're not alone. Inside the unmoving body, Sebastian listened, and for the first time since he'd awakened in his own darkness, he felt a thread of hope. This girl, this slender nurse with sad blue eyes, had become his only ally in a war he couldn't even fight. After that night, Isla knew she couldn't keep fighting this battle alone. Sebastian was awake but powerless, and she could protect him from Derek Shaw's poison, but she had no authority, no voice, no way to do anything beyond swapping IV bags in the dark. She needed an ally, someone with power, someone who could act, and the only person she could think of was Connor Kincaid. But getting to Connor wasn't easy. Every time he came to the hospital to see Sebastian, Cassandra was always there beside him, like a shadow that couldn't be separated. She played the role of the perfect grieving wife so flawlessly it made Isla feel sick every time she saw her. Cassandra cried, Cassandra prayed, Cassandra held her husband's hand and whispered words of love. It was all theater, and Isla was the only one who knew the truth. For 2 days, Isla watched Connor's schedule. She memorized the times he arrived, the times he left, the rare moments when he was alone. Finally, she found an opening. Connor usually parked in the hospital's underground garage, and there was a brief window between the moment he left Sebastian's room and the moment he drove away. That was her only chance. That afternoon, Isla ended her shift early and waited in the parking garage. Her heart hammered when she saw Connor step out of the elevator, tall, hard-faced, his cold eyes sweeping the space like a hunting animal that never stopped watching. Isla drew a deep breath and stepped out to block his path. Connor stopped instantly, his gaze narrowing as he looked at her. She could see his body tighten, ready for any threat. "Who are you? What do you want?" Connor's voice was ice, edged with danger. Isla knew she had only seconds before he shoved her aside, or worse. "Your brother can hear everything," she said fast, her voice low and urgent. "He's awake inside, and someone is trying to kill him." Connor went still. For a moment, the cold mask cracked, shock and confusion showing underneath. But a heartbeat later, he regained control. His hand shot out and grabbed Isla by the collar, yanking her close with terrifying strength. "If this is a trap," Connor growled, his face inches from hers, eyes burning into her, "I swear I'll teach you what regret feels like." Isla wasn't afraid. Or rather, she was, but she wouldn't let fear stop her. She'd faced the deaths of her entire family, survived the darkest nights of her life. Connor Kincaid was frightening, but she had nothing left to lose. "Check the medication chart," Isla said, her voice so calm she surprised herself. "Doctor, Derek Shaw has tripled the sedative dose over the past week. At that dosage, your brother's brain will never recover. That isn't treatment. It's poisoning." Connor didn't speak, but she saw his eyes flicker, processing. "Your sister-in-law visits every day, but she never stays longer than 15 minutes. She cries in front of everyone, but her tears are never real. And Doctor, Derek Shaw, the man invited to save your brother, has a relationship with her." Isla held Connor's gaze. "Put the pieces together." Connor stared at her for a long moment. She could feel him weighing her, testing her, searching for any sign of deception. But Isla had nothing to hide. She let him see everything. The fear in her eyes, the resolve in her voice, and the truth she was trying to give him. Finally, Connor released her. "Prove it," he said, his voice still cold, but less openly threatening. They went together to Sebastian's ICU room. Isla led, Connor close behind, both of them alert to everything around them. By luck, the hallway was empty. No one saw them. Once inside, Isla closed the door and stepped to Sebastian's bedside. She took his hand, gently, the way she always did. "Mr. Kincaid, your brother is here," she said. "I told him. Now you need to show him." Connor stood beside her, watching with suspicion, but also with hope he couldn't hide. Isla turned to him. "One squeeze means yes, 2 squeezes means no. Ask him anything." Connor swallowed hard, then stepped closer to the bed. He looked down at his brother, the man he'd admired more than anyone in his life, now lying still beneath wires and machines. "Can you hear me?" Connor asked, his voice shaking slightly. 1 squeeze. Isla felt the pressure in Sebastian's hand, clear and deliberate. She nodded to Connor to confirm. Connor drew a breath, and his eyes began to redden. "Cassandra, she wants to hurt you, doesn't she?" 1 squeeze. Connor's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. Isla could see the fury flare inside him, the betrayal from his sister-in-law, like a blade driven into the loyalty he'd given his family. "I'll kill her," Connor snarled, hatred thick in his voice. "I'll kill them both, right now." But before he could turn away, Sebastian squeezed twice. Connor froze, staring down at his brother's hand. "No? You don't want me to act?" 2 squeezes again. "Confirmation." Connor turned to Isla, bewilderment on his face. "Why? They're trying to kill him." Isla looked at Sebastian, then back at Connor. She understood. She'd spent enough time beside this man to understand how his mind worked. "He needs more information," she said. "He's gathering proof. If you act right now, they can deny everything. But if you wait, if you let them expose themselves, you'll have everything you need to destroy them completely." Connor watched his brother for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The rage in his eyes didn't vanish, but it tightened into control, turning into a cold, focused resolve. "All right, brother, I'll wait. But when the time comes, I'll be the one who ends them." After the meeting in the ICU room, Connor began to watch Cassandra like an invisible shadow. He hired people to keep eyes on her 24 hours a day, recording every meeting, every phone call, every place her feet touched, and in only 3 days, he had what he needed. Cassandra met Frank Moreno in secret at a small Italian restaurant in the suburbs of Chicago. the kind of place an ordinary person would never think to look for Sebastian Kincaid's wife. Connor didn't dare get too close for fear of being seen, but he'd hired a professional photographer with a telephoto lens to stand across the street. The photos showed Cassandra and Frank sitting across from each other in a hidden corner, their heads bent close like two conspirators planning something dark. At one point, Frank took Cassandra's hand, and she didn't pull away. That night, Connor brought the photos to Sebastian's ICU room. Isla was on the night shift as usual, and she'd become the bridge the two brothers couldn't function without. Connor sat beside his brother and spread the photos out as if Sebastian could see them. "You can't see them," Connor said, his voice catching, "but I'll describe them to you." Cassandra met Frank Moreno. At a suburban restaurant, they sat alone and talked for almost an hour. Frank held her hand. She didn't object. One squeeze. Sebastian heard and understood. Connor went on to report what Harold Bennett, the family attorney, had uncovered after Connor asked him to investigate. Harold was meticulous, careful, the kind of man who missed nothing when he dug into someone's finances, and what he found was even more terrifying than the photographs. Harold found a secret account under an alias in a Swiss bank, Connor said. Over the past 8 months, 3 large transfers were made into it, totaling nearly $2 million. The money came from a shell company Harold traced back to Frank Moreno. One squeeze. Sebastian was still listening. "There's more," Connor continued, his voice shaking with anger. "Harold found a digital agreement, encrypted inside Cassandra's email. She sold you out to Frank Moreno. In exchange, she'll receive 30% of your assets after you die, plus a safe position when Frank takes over the entire Kincaid territory." Isla stood nearby, listening in silence. She felt as if she were sinking into a dark swamp she'd never imagined existed. This wasn't only an affair or a private betrayal. This was underworld politics, a power grab at the highest level. Sebastian Kincaid wasn't only betrayed by his wife, he was being sold to his enemy like property. "The condition of the deal," Connor ground out as he went on, "is that you have to die. And it has to look natural. No suspicion, no evidence. That's why they needed Derek Shaw. He's the pawn, the one who does the dirty work. He gets paid, and he gets Cassandra, and in return he makes sure you never wake up." Connor stopped, his breathing heavy. "About your accident. I'm starting to think it wasn't an accident. Frank Moreno has the resources to stage a collision like that. A truck with no lights, a driver who disappears without a trace. It's all too perfect to be random." The room fell silent after Connor finished. The ventilator kept its steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of time itself, indifferent to the conspiracies and betrayals being laid bare. Isla looked down at Sebastian's hand in hers, waiting for a response. But there was nothing, no single squeeze, no double squeeze. Sebastian was completely still. That moment stretched out, endless. Connor looked at Isla with worry, wondering if his brother could still hear, or if the weight of this news had been too much. Then Isla felt it. Sebastian's hand trembled faintly in hers, not the tremor of fear or weakness. This was the tremor of restrained fury, of a storm building inside a body that couldn't erupt. Isla had held enough patient's hands to know the difference between kinds of trembling, shivering from cold, shaking from fear, trembling from pain, but this was different. It came from deep inside, from a place even Coma couldn't touch. "He isn't afraid," Isla told Connor, her voice soft but certain. "He's angry." Connor looked down at his brother, and for the first time since learning the truth, he smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who knew his enemy had underestimated the opponent. Sebastian Kincaid wasn't the kind of man who went down easily. He'd built an empire from nothing, survived countless plots and betrayals, become the most powerful kingpin in Chicago through intelligence and ruthlessness when it was needed. Cassandra and Frank Moreno thought they'd won because Sebastian lay motionless in a hospital bed, but they didn't know that man was still listening, still thinking, still planning. And when he woke, they would pay for everything. "We keep gathering evidence," Connor said, his voice cold as steel. "When you wake up, we'll have everything we need to bury them." One squeeze from Sebastian. Confirmation. The war had only just begun. Cassandra was sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot when her phone rang. Frank Moreno's number lit up on the screen, and she knew this wasn't a social call. "Hurry up," Frank's voice came the moment she answered, cold and impatient. "I can't wait forever. My rivals are starting to suspect. They're testing my boundaries. I need Sebastian Kincaid to disappear before they figure out what I'm planning." Cassandra clenched her jaw. "I'm doing everything I can. Derek needs time to..." "Time?" Frank cut her off, his voice edged with menace. You've had a whole week. I'm starting to wonder whether you really want this deal to succeed. Of course I do, Cassandra said quickly, forcing her voice to stay even. I'll talk to Derek today. It'll be over this week. It'd better be, Frank said, and hung up. Cassandra sat there for a moment, fighting to control the wild thudding of her heart. She couldn't let everything fall apart when she'd come this far. 10 years she'd waited, 10 years living in Sebastian Kincaid's shadow, and now freedom was right in front of her. She wouldn't let anyone, or anything, stop her. An hour later, she met Derek in his office at the hospital. She closed the door, making sure no one could hear. Increase the dose, Cassandra said flatly. End it this week. Derek frowned, worry creasing his face. If he dies too fast, they'll investigate. A patient who's stable and then suddenly dies will raise questions. Then make it look like a complication, Cassandra said, her voice sharp as glass. You're the doctor. Figure it out. Respiratory failure, sepsis, anything. That's your job. Derek hesitated, but in the end he nodded. He was in too deep to turn back now. All right, but it'd be safer if we transfer him to my facility. There I control everything. And there won't be any eyes watching. Cassandra nodded. It was the perfect plan. She'd file a transfer request today, citing the need for more specialized care. No one could stop a wife who wanted the best for her husband. But she was wrong. That afternoon, as Cassandra walked down the hospital corridor after submitting the transfer request, a figure stepped into her path. Connor Kincaid stood in front of her, his face ice cold, his eyes burning with hatred. Where are you taking my brother? Connor asked, his voice low and dangerous. Cassandra startled, but she recovered quickly. She was the best actress she knew, and she wasn't about to let her brother-in-law ruin her plan. Somewhere better, she replied, layering her voice with practiced worry. Dr. Shaw recommended a rehabilitation center that specializes in traumatic brain injury. They've got more advanced equipment. They can help Sebastian recover faster. My brother stays here, Connor said, not giving an inch. Nobody is transferring him anywhere. Cassandra felt heat rush to her head. She'd tolerated this brother-in-law long enough, always glued to Sebastian like a loyal dog, always looking at her with suspicion. I'm Sebastian's legal wife, Cassandra said, her tone turning cold. I have the right to make medical decisions for my husband. You're only his brother, Connor. You don't have a say here. Connor stepped closer, his eyes like fire meant to burn her down on the spot. And I'm the one who holds my brother's medical power of attorney. Did you forget that? Cassandra went pale. Medical power of attorney. She hadn't known. Sebastian had never told her he'd signed papers, giving Connor authority over all medical decisions if Sebastian couldn't make them himself. It was something she'd missed for 10 years, confident that as his wife she'd automatically control everything. When did he sign that? Cassandra asked, forcing her voice to stay steady while something inside her boiled. Before he married you, Connor replied, a cold smile flickering across his mouth. My brother never puts all his eggs in one basket. You should know that. Cassandra stood there, unable to speak. It felt like a punch to the gut, her perfect plan collapsing right in front of her. If you lay a hand on my brother again, Connor said, his voice dropping into a direct threat, I swear I'll show you what consequences look like, and you know I'm not joking. Cassandra swallowed hard, then turned and walked away without another word. But as she went, her eyes, filled with hatred, slid back to Connor one last time. This war wasn't over. She'd find another way, and when she did, both Sebastian and Connor would pay. Derek Shaw sat in his office, staring at Sebastian Kincaid's blood test results with an expression he couldn't quite name. Something was wrong. Based on the sedative dosage he'd ordered, the midazolam level in Sebastian's blood should have been far higher than this. With the amount being infused, the patient should have been buried in a coma too deep to climb out of, and yet the numbers suggested Sebastian's brain activity was improving faster than expected. Impossible. Derek had calculated everything carefully. Suspicion began to harden inside him, and he decided to investigate. He contacted hospital security and demanded to review the hallway surveillance footage around the ICU for the past week. Sitting in front of the monitor, he fast-forwarded through hours of recordings, hunting for anything out of place. And he found it. Isla Mercer, the slender nurse with sad blue eyes, appeared in Sebastian's room every night, more often than any other nurse. She stayed longer than necessary, and what caught Derek's attention most was the way she hovered near the IV bag. He checked the nursing logs. Isla Mercer was the last person to handle the IV bag each night before the morning shift began. This wasn't coincidence. A surge of anger flared in Derek's chest. She was sabotaging his plan. She was swapping the medication. It was the only explanation for why Sebastian wasn't responding to midazolam the way he was supposed to. A small-time nurse daring to interfere with his work. Derek decided he'd teach her a lesson. That evening, Derek waited in the underground parking garage, where he knew Isla would pass after her shift ended. Flickering fluorescent lights cast alternating pools of brightness and shadow, and the cold air of the garage made the place feel more menacing than ever. When Isla stepped out of the elevator, her body heavy with fatigue after a long night, she didn't notice the figure standing beside a concrete pillar near her car. Not until a voice spoke. "Nurse Mercer, we need to talk." Isla startled and turned, her heart leaping into her throat when she saw Derek Shaw emerge from the darkness. He wore a black coat, his face half lit and half swallowed by the flickering light, like someone stepping out of a nightmare. "About what, doctor?" Isla asked, forcing her voice to stay steady even as she shook inside. Derek moved closer, each step echoing through the empty garage. "You're very devoted to Mr. Kincaid, almost too devoted." Isla swallowed hard. "I'm devoted to all my patients." "Really?" Derek tilted his head, gray eyes cold as scalpels. "Or are you doing something else? I don't understand what you mean." "Don't play games with me," Derek snarled, suddenly grabbing Isla's wrist and yanking her toward him. His grip tightened until it hurt, fingers like iron clamps crushing her slender wrist. "I know what you're doing. I watched the cameras. I checked the logs. You're the last one touching the IV bag every night, and my medication isn't working the way it should. Do you want to explain that?" Pain shot through Isla's wrist, but she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She'd already lost her whole family, lived through the darkest nights of her life. Derek Shaw was terrifying, but she had nothing left to lose. "If I find out you're interfering with my treatment," Derek went on, his voice dropping into a direct threat, "you won't just lose your job, you'll disappear. Completely. Like you never existed. Do you understand?" Isla met his gaze, and in that moment she saw Derek Shaw's true nature. Not a devoted doctor, but a cold-blooded killer hiding beneath a white coat. "I understand that you're hurting me, doctor," Isla said, her voice so calm she surprised even herself. Derek stared at her a beat, then suddenly released her. He gave a cold laugh, the sound echoing through the empty garage. "Good girl. Remember this conversation." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Isla stood there, her legs shaking, threatening to give out. She looked down at her wrist, where bruises were already blooming from Derek's fingers. She wanted to cry, to scream, to run from all of it, but she didn't. She drew a deep breath, steadied herself, and walked back to the elevator. She still had one more thing she had to do tonight. 15 minutes later, Isla stood by Sebastian's bed in the ICU. She took his hand, her whisper urgent. "They know something's wrong. Derek threatened me. He suspects I'm swapping the medication." She paused, swallowing hard. "We don't have much time. It's now or never." Sebastian was still for a moment, and Isla could feel him thinking, weighing everything. Then he squeezed her hand once, hard and final, stronger than he ever had before. It was time. Sebastian Kincaid was going to wake up. The next morning, St. Mary's Hospital witnessed a miracle no one dared to believe. Sebastian Kincaid opened his eyes. Dr. Raymond Cole was the first one called when the morning nurse noticed the patient responding. He rushed into the ICU with a face caught between astonishment and disbelief, then stopped short when he saw Sebastian looking at him, eyes open and aware. "Dear God, Doctor," Cole breathed as he began his examination. "This is an extraordinary recovery. It goes against every prediction." He shone a light into Sebastian's eyes, checked his reflexes, asked simple questions to assess brain function. Sebastian answered slowly, his voice rough after so many days of disuse, but coherent, conscious. The news spread like wildfire. Sebastian Kincaid had woken up. Phones rang all over Chicago, from Connor's office to the darkest corners of the underworld. The most powerful kingpin in the city had come back from the dead, and Cassandra Kincaid raced to the hospital the moment she heard. She arrived in an elegant black dress, hair smoothed into place, makeup flawless even though she claimed she'd been crying all night. She burst into the ICU, eyes red and shining with tears, her whole body trembling like a wife hauled back from hell. "Oh God, Sebastian." Cassandra sobbed as she rushed to her husband's bedside. "You're back. I prayed every day, every hour, every minute. I never lost hope. I knew you'd come back to me." She wrapped her arms around Sebastian, gripping him as if he might vanish. Her choked sobs filled the room, her shoulders shaking in the embrace of the husband who'd just returned from coma. It was the most perfect performance Cassandra had ever delivered. Doctor, Cole and the nurses standing nearby were moved by the tear-soaked reunion. Everyone thought they were witnessing a love story that had survived catastrophe. A faithful wife finally getting her husband back. Then Sebastian looked at Cassandra, and his eyes were completely empty. Who are you?" Sebastian asked, his voice weak, confused. Cassandra went rigid in his arms. Slowly, she lifted her head, staring into her husband's eyes in disbelief. "What?" "Sebastian, it's me. Cassandra, your wife." Sebastian shook his head, his face twisted with pain and confusion. I don't remember. You're saying you're my wife? I'm sorry. I don't remember anything." Cassandra stepped back, her face going pale. "You don't remember me? 10 years together, and you don't remember anything?" Sebastian stared at her with hollow eyes, as if she were a complete stranger. 10 years? I don't know. I can't remember. Who am I? Why am I here?" "Doctor," Cole stepped in, placing a hand on Cassandra's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. "Mrs. Kincaid, please stay calm. This could be a result of the head trauma. I'll have Dr. Shaw come examine him right away." Derek Shaw arrived 10 minutes later. Grave and professional, he ran a series of neurological tests, shining a light into Sebastian's eyes, asking questions about memory, identity, the past. Sebastian answered with the fear and confusion of a man who'd lost himself. "Amnesia," Derek announced when he finished, his voice calm and clinical, though Isla caught the brief flicker of relief in his gray eyes. It's common after severe traumatic brain injury. The patient may recover memories gradually over time, or he may never remember at all. Cassandra stood beside the bed, her expression shocked and devastated. But inside, she was almost screaming with relief. Sebastian remembered nothing, not her whispers at his bedside, not what she'd said to Derek. No memory meant no evidence. She and Derek were safe. The plan might have to change, but she could still get what she wanted. A husband with amnesia was even easier to control than a husband in a coma. "I'll stay with you," Cassandra said, clasping Sebastian's hand with practiced grief. "I'll help you remember everything. We'll rebuild from the beginning." Sebastian looked at her, his eyes still empty, distant. "Thank you. I need time." Cassandra nodded, wiped her tears, and stepped out of the room to speak with Derek in private. She didn't know that behind those hollow eyes, Sebastian Kincaid remembered everything, every poisonous whisper at his bedside, every plot discussed between Cassandra and Derek, every detail of the deal with Frank Moreno. He remembered it all, and he was acting better than anyone in the room. As Cassandra turned away and walked out, Sebastian glanced toward the corner where Isla stood in her nurse's uniform, trying to look ordinary, like any other day. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the corner of Sebastian's mouth lifted, a flicker of a smile so fast only Isla saw it. She understood at once. Sebastian didn't have amnesia. He was playing a game of chess, and the people who thought they were winning were walking straight into a trap they couldn't even see. In the days that followed, Sebastian Kincaid kept playing the part of a man with amnesia, perfectly. He looked at Cassandra with unfamiliar eyes every time she visited, asked innocent questions about their life, about his work, about the people around him. He pretended to be tired when she stayed too long, pretended to have a headache when she pressed him with too many questions. And Cassandra believed him completely. She grew more comfortable than ever, convinced every secret had been buried along with Sebastian's memory. She kept in contact with Frank Moreno, talking through a new plan. Now that Sebastian was awake but didn't remember, they needed to change strategy. Maybe they didn't have to kill him anymore. Maybe they only needed to control him like a puppet. She took calls right in her car in the hospital parking lot, never realizing every conversation was being recorded. Connor and Harold Bennett worked day and night to complete the evidence file. A listening device installed in Cassandra's car captured every conversation between her and Frank, every scheme laid out openly because they thought they were safe. Harold gathered the transfer records tied to Cassandra's secret account, the hidden contracts linked to Frank's shell company, and the digital agreement he'd managed to decrypt. Isla provided the full medication chart showing Derek Shaw's abnormal midazolam increases, along with blood tests proving the drug level in Sebastian's body was far lower than the prescribed dose, evidence that someone had intervened to save him. Connor even found a witness from inside Frank Moreno's organization, a disgruntled man willing to confirm the deal between Frank and Cassandra in exchange for protection. No one knew exactly how Connor convinced him, but the result was a signed statement laying out the entire plot in detail. The night before the confrontation, Isla stayed late in Sebastian's room. The hospital had gone quiet, leaving only the steady hum of machines and the dim light from the hallway slipping through the crack of the door. Sebastian could speak normally now, though his voice was still a little weak. He didn't have to pretend with her, the only person besides Connor who knew the truth. "Isla," Sebastian said, his voice low, serious. She turned to him, blue eyes wide in the muted light. Sebastian took her hand, his grip warmer, stronger than it had been in those first days. "You risked your life for me, a complete stranger. Why?" Isla was quiet for a moment, looking down at the hand holding hers. She'd asked herself that question again and again through sleepless nights, and she still wasn't sure she had a perfect answer. "Because nobody risked their life for my family," she said at last, her voice soft as breath. "When my house was burned, when my parents and my brother died, no one stood up to protect them. No one cared. I can't change the past, but I can change what happens now." Sebastian watched her for a long time, his eyes filled with emotions Isla couldn't quite read. "What do you want from this? Money? Protection? I can give you anything you want." Isla shook her head, a brief, sad smile touching her mouth. "I don't want your money. I don't need protection." She paused, held his gaze. "I only want you to promise me one thing." "What?" "Promise me you'll choose justice, not revenge," Isla said, her tone steady, sincere. "I know who you are. I know you've got the power to do anything you want to the people who betrayed you. But promise me you'll be better than them. Promise me you won't become the thing they think you are." Sebastian didn't answer right away. He looked at Isla, the slender nurse with sad blue eyes, the woman who'd risked everything to save him and asked for nothing in return. In his world, where everything had a price, where loyalty was bought and betrayal was ordinary, Isla's unconditional kindness was more valuable than any treasure. "I promise," Sebastian said at last, his voice deep, certain. Isla looked at him and knew he meant it. This wasn't the empty promise of a Mafia boss. It was the promise of a man who wanted to change, who wanted to be worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. For the first time in years, Sebastian Kincaid wanted to become a better man. Not out of fear, not out of profit, but because a stranger had seen the human being inside him and believed he deserved to be saved. The next morning, Sebastian called for a family meeting in his hospital room. He told the nurse he wanted to see the people he loved, to thank them for staying by him through the hardest stretch of his life. It sounded simple. Moving, even. A man who'd slipped past the Reaper's blade, asking for nothing but a chance to speak. No one suspected a thing. Cassandra arrived first, beautiful and radiant in a cream-white dress, her blonde hair smoothed into a glossy sweep. She entered with the gentle smile of a devoted wife, utterly confident she still held the reins. Sebastian remembered nothing. Derek had confirmed it, and all she had to do was keep playing the perfect wife until she found a way to control his assets completely. Connor and Harold Bennett came in right after, both faces serious, unreadable. Isla stood in the corner in her nurse's uniform, pretending to check the medical equipment as part of her routine work. Cassandra didn't notice her. To Cassandra, Isla was just an anonymous nurse, not worth a thought. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Cassandra asked as she sat by the bed, taking Sebastian's hand with practiced tenderness. "Don't push yourself. You still need rest." Sebastian looked at her, his eyes still hollow and unfamiliar, just as they'd been for days. "Thank you." I want to say a few words." He paused, his voice weak, trembling. "I want to thank all of you for being here with me through this. I know I don't remember much, but I know you care about me." Cassandra smiled, tightening her hold on his hand. Victory was within reach. Sebastian trusted her completely, depended on her completely. She only had to keep this performance going a little longer, and everything would be hers. Then Sebastian lifted his head, and everything changed. The emptiness vanished from his eyes as if it had never been there. In its place was a gaze sharp as a blade, the gaze of the most powerful boss in Chicago, the gaze of a man who'd seen hell and made it back alive. "I remember everything, Cassandra," Sebastian said, and his voice changed with it. No more weakness, no more tremor, only power and a threat that filled the room. "Every word, every whisper, every plan to put me in the ground." Cassandra froze, her face turning white as paper. Sebastian, you're confused. Head trauma can make you. When I stop breathing, you'll dance on my grave. Sebastian cut in, repeating the exact words she'd whispered at his bedside on the first night. Word for word, that's what you said. All color drained from Cassandra's face. She sprang to her feet, looking around like an animal cornered, her eyes sweeping over Connor, over Harold, over Isla, searching for an escape, an ally, anything that might save her. There was nothing. Harold, Sebastian said, never taking his eyes off his wife. Harold Bennett stepped forward, set a leather briefcase on the table, and opened it. Inside were thick files, photographs, audio discs. Conspiracy to commit murder, Harold read aloud, his voice calm and professional, like an indictment being presented in court. Fraud, embezzlement, these are recordings of calls between you and Frank Moreno, discussing how you'd divide Mr. Kincaid's assets after his death. These are transfer records from Frank's shell company into your secret Swiss account. This is evidence showing Dr. Derek Shaw deliberately increased sedative doses to prevent Mr. Kincaid from recovering. And this is a signed statement from a witness inside Frank Moreno's organization, confirming the entire arrangement. Cassandra stared at the evidence stacked in front of her and understood she'd lost. Completely. Irrevocably. She spun and lunged for the door, but Connor was already there, blocking the exit. His eyes were ice, filled with hatred. 10 years, Sebastian said, his voice dropping, heavy with pain and fury. I gave you 10 years. I gave you everything you wanted. I gave you a life anyone would have dreamed of. And this is how you repay me? Cassandra turned back to her husband, and for the first time in 10 years, she stopped acting. Tears streamed down her cheeks, real tears at last. Not from remorse, but from rage and desperation. You never loved me, she screamed, bitterness shredding her voice. I was just another thing in your collection, a trophy to display, a perfect picture for your perfect life. Did you ever see me as a human being? Did you ever care what I wanted, what I felt? She collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with choking sobs. I hate you. I hate the shadow I've had to live in for 10 years. I hate that I'm nothing but Sebastian Kincaid's wife. Sebastian looked at the woman breaking in front of him and felt a deep, unexpected pain. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd never truly seen her. Maybe he'd treated her like part of his empire instead of a partner. But none of that excused what she'd done. Maybe you're right, Sebastian said, his voice cold now, but no longer burning with hatred. Maybe I didn't love you the way you wanted to be loved, but I never tried to kill you. After the confrontation in the hospital room, Chicago's underworld held its breath and waited. Everyone knew Sebastian Kincaid would take revenge, and by the law of that world, revenge was supposed to be paid in blood. Cassandra had plotted to kill her husband. Frank Moreno had tried to seize his territory. Derek Shaw had poisoned him. By the usual logic, all three should die, and their deaths would be a warning to anyone reckless enough to imagine betraying Sebastian Kincaid. That night, Connor met his brother alone in the hospital room. What do you want me to do with her? And with Frank? Connor asked, his voice cold, ready. He'd prepared everything, only waiting for one order from Sebastian for the matter to be handled the way the underworld always handled it. Sebastian stayed silent for a long time, looking out the window where Chicago's lights flickered in the dark. Then he said something no one expected. Let her go. Connor went still. What? You can't be serious. She tried to kill you. I know, Sebastian answered, calm. Give her a choice. A quiet divorce, a small amount of money, enough to start over, and she leaves Chicago for good and never shows her face again. If she refuses, or if she breaks the terms, then you can do whatever you want. When Cassandra was brought before Sebastian one last time, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're letting me go? She asked, her voice shaking with disbelief at her own luck. Sebastian looked at her, his eyes no longer burning with hatred, only exhaustion, and something that looked almost like sadness. Revenge would make me no different than you, and I promised someone I'd be better than that. Cassandra followed his gaze and saw Isla standing in the corner of the room. In that instant, she understood everything. The small, invisible nurse she'd never bothered to notice had saved her husband's life and changed him. But it was too late for jealousy, too late for regret. Cassandra left Chicago the next day with a small suitcase and whatever was left of her life. No one knew where she went, and no one cared. Derek Shaw wasn't so lucky. The evidence that he deliberately poisoned a patient was sent to the medical board and the police. He lost his license and faced years in prison for intentional harm and conspiracy to commit murder. The career he'd spent his life building collapsed overnight, and the name Derek Shaw became a symbol of corruption in medicine. As for Frank Moreno, he was handled in the way the underworld handled its own. No one knew exactly what happened, and no one asked. They only knew that after that night, the name Frank Moreno stopped appearing in any conversation in Chicago's underworld. 3 months later, Sebastian Kincaid returned home and began a new life. He wasn't the same man he'd been before, the man who only knew power and control. The weeks he'd spent motionless in a hospital bed, listening to whispers in the dark, had changed him in ways no one expected. He founded a charity in Tommy's name, Isla's younger brother, dedicated to helping victims of violence and loan sharking. Families like Isla's, people driven to the edge by ruthless men, now had a place to turn for help. Sebastian asked Isla to run the foundation. At first, she refused, unwilling to accept anything from him in return for what she'd done. "I didn't save you to be repaid," Isla said. "I know," Sebastian answered. "You saved me when you had nothing to gain. This isn't charity. It's a chance for you to save other people the way you saved me, and I can't think of anyone better than you to do it." Isla finally accepted. On a Chicago night, 3 months after everything that had happened, Sebastian and Isla stood on the penthouse balcony, looking down at the city. The lights glittered below like millions of stars fallen to earth, and the cold autumn air carried the scent of new beginnings. They stood side by side, not touching, but the space between them had changed. No longer nurse and patient, no longer savior and saved. They were two people who'd seen each other in their weakest moments, and still chose to stay. "Do you know what I learned lying in that hospital bed? Unable to move, unable to speak?" Sebastian asked, his eyes still on the city. "What?" Isla asked. Sebastian turned to her, and his eyes softened in a way she'd never seen before. "The way people treat you when you can't give them anything tells you everything you need to know about them." Isla looked at him, waiting. "And what did you learn about me?" she asked quietly. Sebastian smiled, for the first time a real smile. Not the smile of a powerful kingpin, but the smile of a man who'd found his faith in people again. That there are people worth trusting, even when you've forgotten how to trust for a long time. They stood there in silence, watching Chicago's lights shimmer below. Nothing else needed to be said. Sometimes the deepest feelings don't need words, and the strongest bonds are formed when all we have left is trust. Sebastian and Isla's story reminds us of something important about life. When we lose all power and status, when we're vulnerable and can't protect ourselves, that's when the true nature of the people around us is revealed. Cassandra, the wife of 10 years, chose betrayal when she believed her husband no longer had value. Isla, a complete stranger, chose to risk her life to save someone she didn't even know. The lesson here isn't only about betrayal or loyalty, it's also about choice. Sebastian chose justice instead of revenge, forgiveness instead of killing. He chose to become a better man, not because he was weak, but because he was strong enough to rise above hatred. And Isla chose to do what was right even when it meant danger, because she understood that silence in the face of evil is a form of complicity. In life, we always have choices. To choose love or hatred, forgiveness or revenge, to stand up or bow down. Those choices define who we are, more than any circumstance or fate ever could. Thank you for listening to today's story. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. Don't forget to like and share this video with the people you love. We'd truly like to hear how you feel about this story. Have you ever been betrayed by the people closest to you? Have you ever been helped by a stranger when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments below. Every story you share matters, and we're listening with all our hearts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in each day. Remember, no matter how hard life gets, there are always good people around you, and you can be that good person for someone else. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.